In this lecture, I just want to give a quick recap of some of the ideas that we covered in Marxist theory. Again, Marxist theory is really kind of foundational to the course and to a discussion of inequality, so I just want to hit some of the high points conceptually and make sure we understand that before we go on. Basically, Marx believed that society is founded on economic relationships, that money matters, and that money provides the basis upon which all aspects of society interrelate, that our relationship to the means of production are foundational to every other social institution and every social relationship. I'm going to skip ahead real quick. What do I mean by our relationship to the means of production? Well, we discussed this in the last lecture, that we have different positions as they relate to the way in which a society sustains itself, to how money is made. And remember, I talked about how capitalists they own the means of production in the Industrial Revolution. They were the factory owners. They might be business owners, and they would be the ones who own capital. They own the ability to make money. They have money that can be turned around into resources that allow them to make more money. The lumpen proletariat, I'll skip down to the third point, are those who are excluded from the means of production. They don't have anything to contribute economically, or very little to contribute economically. So they don't own, they don't have any financial resources to bring to the table. They don't have money to make money, and then they don't have labor to sell. They're unable to sell their labor on the market. The workers of the proletariat, their relationship to the means of production is that they can sell their labor to the capitalists. They have labor to contribute, and that's their primary resource. Capitalists have financial resources. The proletariat has physical resources, or maybe now we would say intellectual resources, or some skills that they can contribute. But basically, they can sell their labor to the capitalists to sustain a living. And then the lumpen proletariat have neither capital nor necessarily skill or social resources, physical resources to participate in the economic system. So they're excluded. So what does this structure mean? Basically, the argument is that the economy and your relationship, the way that the economy sustains itself, people's relationship to production, if you look at the red box, establishes the base upon which everything else in society functions. So if you think of a house, the red part would be the foundation of the house, and it's upon that foundation that other places of social relationships, the educational system, families, religion, politics, and the media, all of these other things which don't seem like they're economic are actually very much shaped by the economic system. And they also maintain or legitimate that economic system, meaning that they create systems and narratives that allow people to believe that the method of production is legitimate and should always be that way. Let me give you an example of how this might play out. We have a particular economic system, a capitalist system, where buying and selling, consuming, making transactions is very ordinary. It's a very ordinary part of life. And we do it in all sorts of different ways at all sorts of different times. We can see, okay, we have this economic system. We assume that this is strictly based in places like Walmart. I buy something. But actually, we can see this same type of economy being used behaviorally. For example, in a classroom, a teacher might offer a piece of candy if you get your work done on time. In the family, and I'm guilty of this, particularly when my kids were young, I would say, well, if you're good today in church, then I'll give you 50 cents when we leave. And so it's a financial transaction. Or I'll take you to the movies and we'll see this movie. Again, I'm giving them a resource for behavior. It's an economic transaction. Eventually, my son learned how to negotiate. So I can bargain with mom then for what I get. So instead of 50 cents, it becomes, well, I need $1.50, right? And the fact that I participated in this means can be evidence of the fact that the economy is pervasive in all sorts of interactions that we don't think of as economic interactions. Those interactions also legitimate the base. And by that I mean that we're in having that kind of relationship with my son, I'm also teaching him that these transactions are legitimate and that we do bargain. And I come to the table and ask for something, and you give it to me and I pay for it. That a consumption of behavior, that this is the normal way in which life occurs. This justifies a particular form of production. And so they work together to the base shapes the superstructure, and then the values that become embedded in the superstructure then maintain the base. They make sure that people follow the rules of the economic system, that they come to believe that the economic system is the correct system, that it's a just system. Now, he's not necessarily making an indictment at this point on anything, but the idea then is that these two things are interrelated, the base and the superstructure. Okay, so we have these classes and our relationship to those particular means of production. I've already outlined this. I think I've mentioned before that there is constant tension or conflict as just built into this type of system. And there begins to develop what Marx called a class consciousness, that people understand their position within the system and they understand the tension built into the system and they act accordingly. I had a student today in class who mentioned that he was in the Marines, and there are different status of Marines that are offered or required to do different jobs, and that there was always this real identity associated with your class, and there was always animosity or at least complaining towards those who are above you, simply because there's tension in the job. Someone can be very nice, but there's tension that comes about from just simply participating and being a part of that system and having a job that's in conflict with maybe what you want to do and then what an officer's telling you to do. I'm sure you can think of examples where maybe people at your work have developed a class consciousness. We might not call it class consciousness exactly, but if you can imagine going to dinner with your coworkers or to get a drink with your coworkers, if you start complaining about your boss, that's a form of class consciousness, that we all share some kind of experience based on where we are in this economic relationship. So basically, again, this idea of shared interest is important, and the idea of conflict is important. That conflict isn't that they're necessarily physically fighting, and it's not that they don't get along. It's possible for people to get along quite well and still have interests that are in conflict with each other. I might get along with a colleague, but I still need to make a profit. If I'm the owner of a small business, I might like my employees, but I still have to let some of them go in order to maximize a profit or to even earn a profit in a particular year. Their interests are contradictory. One wants to stay employed, one wants to make a profit. Okay, Marx argued that this type of conflict is persistent. It has been true, and he tracked it throughout history. Much of his writing is a historical analysis of how this conflict has run through an agrarian economy, an industrial economy, and he's very meticulous in his historical evaluations of economic systems throughout time. He says it'll be true in the future as well. Now, what happens in the future, or how did he theorize future systems? And a lot of people argue that he theorized communism in the form that it was in historically, Soviet Union and China. That's not actually, it's a little simplified to say that, and I'll explain why. Marx is called a dialectic materialist, and he adopted specific philosophical ideas very purposefully. And the first is called the dialectic. Now, he draws this idea of the dialectic from a philosopher named Hegel, Hegel, if you're interested. From Hegel, there's this idea that there is a condition, a thesis, there's a antithesis, or its opposing condition, and there has to be a synthesis that comes from the two again. I like to see it as there's a problem, a thesis, there's a solution, an antithesis. We might solve that particular problem, but inherent in that solution are tensions. There are other issues that are going to arise and create a new problem, a thesis, a new antithesis, and then there has to be a solution again to that problem. That problem is also going to have contradictions, problems within it that have to be unpacked and solved again. So there's this kind of cyclical process that goes on, and there's always going to be a reinvention or a necessary process by which we solve problems that are created by our solutions. I like to use the example, and I may have in the last lecture, of global warming, that we might solve the problem of global warming, but are those solutions going to contain conflicts or problems that need to be solved again? Plastic, the presence of BPA. Okay, we've solved the idea that we've taken BPAs out of plastics, but have we included another ingredient that is just as dangerous or more dangerous than the BPAs? Sorry. So a thesis, a problem, a solution, more conflict and problems embedded in the solution that also have to be solved. Keep this in mind as we go on and talk about some of his other theory, or pull it all together. Marx was also a materialist. Again, this idea taken from Hegel. I'm sorry, maybe, anyway, never mind. The idea that prior to Marx, there was this philosophical tradition that privileged ideas and values and kind of thought as a way to establish reality, that our reality is shaped by common ideas about human nature, social responsibility, not by real-world experience. Okay, Marx countered this by saying that actually material things matter, stuff matters, money matters, and it's upon those real-life things that all social relationships are determined, the base and the superstructure. It's not what I think about reality or what values I have as I confront reality. It's actual economic conditions that establish reality. I had an example, and I've just lost it, of what that is. So I'm sorry, but we'll move on in interest of time. Okay, so when we put these two together, what can we say? Well, again, the idea is that Marx, or it's popularly believed that Marx theorized communism as it was applied, and he believed that the communist system was the best system out there. Well, I think if we look at it from the perspective of him adopting a dialectic position, that's not really how I would interpret Marx, and many sociologists would not interpret Marx in that way. The idea would be, and this is just an illustration of how historically he's tracked that. You don't really need to know the contents of the picture. It's just showing us that there are tensions. Okay, in the ancient world, the feudal system, we come up with solutions, noble slaves, come up with lords, an alternative system. This creates tension between the lords and the serfs, yada yada. He believed that socialism would help alleviate some of these tensions. When we begin to develop systems that take care of the lumpen proletariat, that help provide a more just working environment, that provide for the lumpen proletariat, that provide a more just working conditions for the proletariat, socialism, then that tension will be removed. But socialism would be a solution to a problem, and within that problem we would have conflict and tension. Therefore, communism might be a solution to the socialist conflict. Now, if we followed this through, and my theory professor said, well, Marx just died before he theorized the next step. Communism would have its own contradictions, its own problems, and there would be another historical solution that would be required. Now, there are some things, I've attached the Communist Manifesto in your course weeks, and if you read it, there are some hallmarks of communism. He believed that private property should be abolished. I'm sympathetic theoretically, but I like private property, right? There are also some things that Marx said would be hallmarks of communism that we would appreciate. Public education for all. I've had some students in class say, and it should be through university level. So the idea of public education is something that we might say is something we would agree with. But even in a communist state, there would be additional problems. Marx also didn't necessarily believe that a communist state should be brought about quickly or should be brought about as it was. And in fact, he said at one point, he said, well, people are writing and calling me a communist. I'm not sure what a communist is if it's defined as how people are defining it. Basically, I don't know that I'm a communist if they're telling me that communism is like this. He also was written a letter where people were hypothesizing an uprising, and he told them, don't do this, this will get you killed, don't try to abolish private property. So I think the idea that Marxism, first of all, is just wholesale bad is something that isn't correct, and then that Marx saw communism as an end-all be-all is not correct, because of this idea that in and of itself it would have to evolve into something as well. Okay, the tensions in the class system result in alienation. Alienation is the idea that we feel somehow disconnected from the work that we do. And in fact, we resent in many ways the work that we do. I like to see pilfering, if anyone's stolen pens, paper pads. I had a student say she stole forks so that she'd have kitchen utensils from her job. The idea that we aren't being fairly rewarded, that our work is potentially meaningless, all those things are attributes of alienation within labor. When I say routinization of tasks, I mean that the tasks become so mundane and particular that we're not doing anything interesting, and then we're not paid well enough to do the job that we're doing. Now, alienation results from this idea that we're not fulfilling our species being. Now, species being is the literal translation of the German word that Marx used. And if you're religious or have attended church, species being, now Marx wasn't religious, but species being is akin to the idea of calling, that we have this inner drive, this inner need that just comes out of who we are to fulfill particular tasks. And then when everyone fulfills those tasks, the needs of society will be fulfilled. It's very idealistic, but I think it's just a great idea theoretically. Species being would be that thing we would do simply because we love to do it. If we had all the money in the world, we didn't have to worry about sustaining ourselves, then we would act out of our species being. We would be doing that thing which drives us. Now, Marx didn't see, again, communism as being driven by altruism, that we just want to share with everybody. He actually saw it as a very self-serving system, that when everybody is doing what drives them, we are mutually dependent upon that thing that you're doing. I mean, we're all dependent upon us fulfilling our drives well. For example, I had a student in class today who said his species being would be to hunt, that he could hunt all the time, and he's actually very good at it. I like to cook. It's in my interest for him to be a good hunter, and I need food to cook. He needs his food cooked. So if he brings me food and I cook it, I fulfill his need, he fulfills my need. And it's this mutual dependence that's actually selfishness, in a way, that fulfills society's needs. Now, I tell you this not because, I'll be honest, I don't necessarily believe this might happen, but I believe it's a really nice idea. His real point isn't that society should develop. It's that disconnect between our species being and the labor that we perform is what causes alienation. Okay, and we're at the tail end now, so thanks for hanging with me. He also argued that labor is exploitative, or exploitation creates alienation. And this is the idea that workers produce more value, they produce profit for their companies or for the capitalists, but they receive little reward. They don't receive a fair share of the profit of the capital that they've worked to create. Okay, so labor has monetary value. Again, the idea is that the labor creates the product, and the labor creates the measure of the value of the product. So for example, it creates something, a tennis shoe, a television, an iPod, an iPad, an iPhone, that I was blanking on the iPhone, that it creates the thing of value, the product. It also creates the measure of the value of product. Every product has a market value. We have markets of stuff that we buy and sell, and we have values within that market. The product has some kind of market, some kind of value set by the market. He argued that there's surplus value, meaning that a product can earn a company far more money than it costs to earn, costs to make. So again, there's profit. The extent to which there's a disconnect between the profit and the cost of labor, he would say that that's a measure of exploitation, right? So the more profit that's made that goes to shareholders and not to the employees, then the more exploited an employee is. So if we take tennis shoes as an example, how much does it cost to produce a pair of tennis shoes? And actually, you might want to look this up, because I've had students look this up before, and they're pretty shocked by how much it actually costs to produce a pair of Nikes and how much the laborers are paid to produce the Nikes. But for each pair, we have the material cost. How much does the rubber and the plastic and the fabric cost actually to make the shoe? And then we have a cost of labor. How much does it cost us to pay people to actually create the shoe? We also have the price of a product. Now, the price of the product is going to be shaped by demand for that product. Profit is surplus value, meaning that when the price of the product is greater than the cost and the labor, then there's surplus value for that pair of shoes. Nikes, I think, are sold for about $80, some of them 90. The material cost and labor is actually pretty low on the production of a pair of Nikes, and if you consider the fact that an employee is producing multiple pair of Nikes every day, they're producing a lot of value for the company, a lot of profit for the company. And again, the idea is that this value isn't returned to the workers, but it's removed from the work process. It goes to shareholders. It goes to people that are disconnected from the work process. Again, Marx would call this exploitation. Okay, so hopefully this recap helped a little bit, and in our next lecture we're going to be talking about functionalist theories and how they explain class differences.